There is a document in Philadelphia that changed the world. It is written on 4 pages of parchment. It begins with 3 words that have echoed across 2.5 centuries with the resonance of a bell struck at the founding moment of something genuinely new, with the people. The United States Constitution, ratified in 1788, amended 27 times. Studied in law schools and political science departments and civics classrooms across the globe, is the oldest written national constitution still in active use. It has been called the greatest political document in human history. It has been called the foundation of modern democracy. It has been called the blueprint that other nations have followed, adapted, and imitated in their own struggles to govern themselves without kings. What it has not been called, in most of the classrooms where it is taught and most of the histories where it is celebrated, is what it also is. The inheritor of ideas that were not born in Philadelphia, not born in the libraries of European Enlightenment philosophy, not born in the writings of Locke or Montesquieu or Rousseau, though all of those contributed. Ideas that were born on the northeastern coast of North America, in the forests and longhouses of a people who had been practicing representative Confederate governance for centuries before a single European ship arrived on their shores. The year is approximately 1450, perhaps earlier. The scholars still debate the precise date, and the oral traditions of the people themselves carry the story in forms that resist the calendar precision of European historical record keeping. But somewhere in that era, somewhere in the period when Europe was still emerging from its medieval period, when the Renaissance was just beginning to stir in the Italian city-states, when the printing press was a new invention and the idea of representative government was a philosophical speculation rather than a lived reality anywhere on earth, a man arrived in a canoe. He came from the north. He came across Lake Ontario in a white stone canoe that the people who watched him land had never seen before. He was called Deganawida, the Peacemaker, and he carried a vision so radical, so completely contrary to the political reality of the world he was entering, that the people he brought it to initially rejected it. Not because they were unwise. Because the vision was almost incomprehensibly ambitious. The permanent cessation of the blood feud cycle that was consuming the nations of the northeastern woodlands in an endless, exhausting war of revenge and counter-revenge. Not a truce, not a treaty, something deeper and more permanent. A great law that would bind the nations together in a confederacy of mutual obligation, shared governance, and constitutionally guaranteed rights that no individual leader could override. The world Deganawida was entering was a world at war with itself. The Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, known to Europeans by the French name Iroquois, were 5 nations living in the territories that would become upstate New York. The Mohawk in the east, the Onondaga in the center, the Cayuga and the Seneca to the west, and the Oneida between them. They shared a linguistic heritage, common cultural practices, a cosmological framework, organized around the Great Spirit, and the sky world and the world tree whose roots reached into the earth, and whose branches held creation in balance. And they were tearing each other apart. The blood feud, the obligation to avenge every death with a death, every injury with an injury, every killing with a killing, had locked the 5 nations into a cycle of retaliate violence that no individual act of courage or diplomacy could break, because the cycle was structural. The feud was the system, and the system perpetuated itself regardless of anyone's desire for peace. Into this world came the Peacemaker. With a vision. With a partner named Hiawatha, a man of the Onondaga or Mohawk people, depending on the tradition, who had himself been broken by the blood feud's violence, who had lost his daughters to it, who had descended into a grief so deep that the tradition describes it as a form of madness, who would be healed by the Peacemaker's words and would become his voice, his diplomat, his translator, the orator who took the vision and made it comprehensible to the leaders whose agreement it required. Together, they were going to do something that the world had not seen: build a constitutional government. With separation of powers. With representative assemblies. With guaranteed rights that could not be overridden by any single individual. With a mechanism for peaceful conflict resolution that replaced the blood feud with deliberation. With the explicit recognition that the governance of human communities was a problem that required system-level solutions rather than the personal virtue of individual leaders. And 300 years later, The men who were trying to build a republic in Philadelphia were need every idea that the Peacemaker had carried in that white canoe. The story of the great law of peace, the Gayanashagawa, the foundational law of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, begins not with a political theory but with a personal devastation. Hiawatha was, by all accounts in the oral tradition, a man who understood violence from the inside. He was a warrior. He was skilled in the arts of war that the blood feud culture of the northeastern woodlands produced and demanded. He had participated in the cycle of raid and counter, raid and counter, revenge that was consuming his people. And then, the specific circumstances vary across the oral threat nations. He lost his daughters. 3 daughters in some versions. 7 in others. Killed, directly or indirectly, by the violence of the world he in, or by the sorcerer. Leader Haudenosaunee, the most feared and most powerful of the Onondaga leaders. A man described in the tradition as physically and spiritually twisted. Whose hair was described as a mass of living serpents. Whose power over his people rested on fear and the threat of supernatural violence. Hiawatha's grief was, by the tradition's account, total. He left his community. He walked into the forest alone, speaking to no one, his mind fractured by a loss that the community's normal mechanisms of mourning and consolation could not reach. He was performing, in his isolation, the very condition that the blood feud culture produced at its extreme. A person so consumed by grief and its associated rage that normal social function had become impossible. It was in this state that he encountered Deganawida. The tradition is precise about the form of the encounter. The Peacemaker found Hiawatha in the forest in his grief, and performed on him the first act of what would become the condolence ceremony. The ritual of grief acknowledgement and consolation. That is one of the great law's most distinctive and most profound innovations. He calmed the snakes from Hiawatha's mind, metaphorically, through the recitation of the words that acknowledged grief, that named it and honored it, and then, carefully, gently, moved through it toward the restoration of right thinking that the tradition called the good mind. He wiped Hiawatha's eyes so he could see clearly. He unstopped his ears so he could hear. He cleared his throat so he could speak. The condolence ceremony that the Peacemaker performed on Hiawatha in the forest was not merely a personal healing ritual. It was a political technology. The insight embedded in it, that governance requires people capable of clear thinking, and that clear thinking requires the acknowledgement and processing of grief before it calcifies into the rage that perpetuates the blood feud, was one of the most psychologically sophisticated elements of the Great Law. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was built on the recognition that politics and psychology were not separate domains. That the state of the minds of the people who governed was governance problem of the first order. Hiawatha healed. He became the Peacemaker's partner and voice. And the two of them began the extraordinary work of carrying the vision of the Great Law to the 5 nations, one leader at a time, one Longhouse at a time. One act of persuasion and demonstration and patient argument at a time, until the most feared and resistant of all the leaders could be reached. Haudenosaunee was the problem the Great Law could not bypass. The twisted Onondaga sorcerer, leader whose power rested on fear, and whose resistance to the Great Law was both personal and structural. Personal because the law would end the power that violence and the threat of violence gave him. Structural because the Onondaga were the central nation, and without the Onondaga's agreement the Confederacy could not span the territory it needed to span. The Peacemaker and Hiawatha had worked through the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Seneca, each negotiated, each convinced by a combination of vision and argument, and demonstration of the law's practical advantages. Haudenosaunee remained. The tradition's account of Haudenosaunee transformation is one of the most remarkable passages in the oral literature of any indigenous people of North America. The Peacemaker did not defeat Haudenosaunee. He did not overpower him or exile him or eliminate him. He transformed him through the same condolence process. Through the same recognition of the grief and the damage that had produced the twisted sorcerer. Through the offer of a role within the new system that acknowledged rather than eliminated Haudenosaunee power. In the Confederacy structure, the Onondaga would be the firekeepers, the nation that maintained the Central Council fire, whose leader would be the chairman of the Grand Council. Haudenosaunee power was not destroyed. It was constitutionalized. incorporated into a system of checks and balances that prevented it from becoming tyranny. This was the political genius at the heart of the griot, not the elimination of power, but its institutionalization. Not the defeat of the powerful but their incorporation into a structure that made the abuse of power structurally difficult. It was a lesson in constitutional design that the founders of the American Republic would, 3 centuries later, recognize and apply, even if they did not always explicitly acknowledge where they had learned it. The great law of peace that Deganawida and Hiawatha brought to the 5 nations was not a simple document. It was a comprehensive constitutional framework, an oral constitution of extraordinary complexity, preserved through generations in the memories of trained specialists, enacted and re-enacted through the ceremonies that kept its truths alive and accessible to each new generation. Its provisions are specific and detailed in ways that continue to astonish scholars who study them. The Grand Council of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was composed of 50 sachems, chiefs, drawn from the 5 nations according to a fixed distribution that reflected each nation's historical position in the Confederacy's formation. The Onondaga held 14 seats, the Cayuga 10, the Oneida 9, the Mohawk 9, and the Seneca 8. The specific numbers encoded a balance of representation that gave no single nation a controlling majority and required genuine consensus for any significant decision. The decision-making process was itself a marvel of constitutional design. The 50 sachems did not simply vote. They deliberated through a structured process that required each group to reach internal consensus before presenting its position to the larger assembly, and required the Onondaga firekeepers to ratify any decision before it became the law of the Confederacy. This multi-stage deliberative process was, in modern political science terms, a sophisticated system of checks and balances, a mechanism for preventing hasty decision-making and ensuring the action taken by the Confederacy reflected genuine broad agreement, rather than the momentary advantage of a temporary majority. The sachems themselves were not elected in the European democratic sense. They were chosen by the clan mothers, the senior women of each clan, whose authority over the selection of male leadership was explicit, institutional, and protected by the Great Law. If a sachem failed in his duties, if he became corrupted, or ceased to represent his people's interests, or violated the principles of the Great Law, the clan mothers had the authority to dehorn him, to remove his title and his authority, and replace him with someone better suited to the position. This institution of structured accountability, the formal mechanism for removing leaders who failed, had no equivalent in European political systems of the same era, and few equivalents in the world at large. The Great Law also contained explicit protections for individual rights, the right of freedom of speech in the council, the right to be heard, the protection of the home from arbitrary entry, provisions for the humane treatment of prisoners of war. These protections were not rhetorical aspirations. They were constitutional provisions with enforcement mechanisms, specific consequences for their violation, specific processes for their vindication. The establishment of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy transformed the political landscape of the northeastern woodlands in ways that were immediately apparent to everyone in its range. The 5 nations that had been locked in the blood-feud cycle of violence were under the Great Law, bound to resolve their internal disputes through council deliberation rather than warfare. The Grand Council became the mechanism for conflict resolution, a court as well as a legislature, a diplomatic institution as well as a governing body, and the peace that the Great Law established within the Confederacy created unified political and military power that transformed the 5 nations' relationship with every other nation in the region. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy became, in the centuries between its founding and the arrival of European colonists, the most powerful and most sophisticated political entity in the northeastern part of the continent. Its territory extended from the Hudson Valley to the Great Lakes. Its warriors were feared and its diplomats were respected. Its trade networks connected communities from the Atlantic coast to the interior of the continent. And its governance system, the Grand Council deliberating around the central fire at Onondaga, the clan mothers maintaining the accountability of the sachems, the Great Law providing the constitutional framework for all of it, was functioning as a representative Confederate democracy when Columbus was still in his childhood in Genoa. The early triumphs of the Confederacy were not primarily military, though military capability was real and significant. They were diplomatic and organizational. The achievement of internal peace among the 5 nations, the establishment of governance structures that maintained that peace across generations, the development of a political culture in which deliberation replaced violence as the primary mechanism for resolving disputes among the Confederacy's member nations. These were achievements of a political order that European civilization would not approach for centuries. And when European civilization finally did approach them, the approach would be shaped, more than most histories acknowledge, by direct observation of what the Haudenosaunee had already built. By the time European colonists began establishing permanent settlements on the northeastern coast of North America, in the early 17th century, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had been functioning as a constitutional government for at least a century, and possibly for 2 or 3 centuries. Depending on which scholarly dating of the Great Law's founding is accepted, the arrival of the Europeans did not diminish the Confederacy's power. Initially, it increased it. The fur trade, the economic engine of early European colonial expansion in northeastern North America, ran through Haudenosaunee territory. The Confederacy positioned itself as the essential middleman between the European trading posts on the coasts and the interior sources of the beaver pelts that European fashion had made enormously valuable. The Haudenosaunee sachems who negotiated with Dutch and later English and French traders were not supplicants seeking European favor. They were powerful political leaders managing relationships with new trading partners from a position of genuine strength. Strength built on the military unity that the Great Law and the geographic position that placed Haudenosaunee territory at the center of the northeastern continent's most valuable trade routes. The Confederacy's diplomatic sophistication impressed the Europeans who encountered it in ways that the colonial accounts document. Even through the distorting lens of cultural arrogance, the sachems who met with European governors and colonial officials conducted themselves with a formality and a procedural precision that the Europeans recognized, sometimes reluctantly, as equal to their own. The wampum belts that the Haudenosaunee used to record treaties and agreements were not, as the Europeans often characterized them, primitive alternatives to written documents. They were sophisticated mnemonic devices whose reading required trained specialists. Diplomats whose entire professional function was the preservation and accurate transmission of the Confederacy's treaty obligations and diplomatic history. The 17th century was the century in which the Haudenosaunee Confederacy reached the apex of its territorial influence, the period historians sometimes call the Iroquois Wars, or from the Haudenosaunee perspective, the period of morning wars and Confederacy expansion. The specific dynamics of this expansion are complex and contested, involving the fur trade's economic pressures, the disruptions caused by European disease, the specific political choices of Confederacy leadership, but the outcome was clear by the mid-17th century. The Haudenosaunee had defeated and incorporated or dispersed the Huron Confederacy, the Erie Nation, the Neutral Nation, and numerous other peoples, extending the Confederacy's influence across a territory of extraordinary scope. The political structure that managed this expansion was the Grand Council operating at full constitutional capacity, making decisions about war and peace through the deliberative process the Great Law prescribed, negotiating with European colonial powers through a diplomatic corps of remarkable sophistication, managing the internal tensions of a confederacy that's both expanding its reach and absorbing the disruptions of contact with European civilization. The system was under stress, but it was functioning. But relationship with the English colonies was particularly significant for what would eventually follow. The Haudenosaunee and the English colonies of the northeastern seaboard, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, conducted a sustained diplomatic relationship across the 17th and 18th centuries, meeting in formal treaty councils where the Haudenosaunee sachems demonstrated, for any colonial observer paying attention, exactly what a representative Confederate government looked like in practice. The council fires at Albany, at Lancaster, at Onondaga, where sachems deliberated publicly, where the Great Law's procedures were followed, where the relationship between representative governance and collective decision making was visible to anyone who came to observe, were schools of political education for the colonists who attended them. Some of those colonists were paying attention with extraordinary focus. The year is 1744. The place is Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And what is happening in that meeting hall is one of the most consequential conversations in the history of North American political thought, though it would take generations for its consequences to be fully understood. The Treaty of Lancaster was a diplomatic council convened to address disputes between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the colonial governments of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. The Haudenosaunee delegation was led by Canasatego, the Onondaga Sachem, who was, by the consensus of everyone who encountered him, one of the most formidable political figures of his era, a man of extraordinary oratorical power, deep knowledge of both Haudenosaunee law and the colonial political landscape, and a willingness to speak with a directness that colonists accustomed to diplomatic euphemism found startling. Canasatego negotiated the treaty's terms with the precision and authority of a man operating at the center of the most powerful political institution in northeastern North America. But it was not the treaty's specific terms that made Lancaster historically consequential. It was what Canasatego said at the end of the proceedings, when he turned from the specific business of the treaty to address the broader political situation of the English colonies themselves. He looked at the representatives of three separate colonial governments, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, sitting in the same room, conducting their diplomacy with him separately, unable to agree among themselves on the positions they were taking, and he offered them the observation that must have precisely, because it was accurate. Why heart you recommend union, and a good agreement between you, our brethren. Never disagree, but preserve a strict friendship for one another, and thereby you, as well as we, will become the stronger. And then he went further. He told them specifically what that union should look like. It should look like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a central council where the colonial governments sent representatives, where decisions were made collectively, where no single colony could veto the common interest for the sake of its own particular advantage. The speech was recorded verbatim and published. It was read throughout the colonies. Benjamin Franklin printed it multiple times. He considered it important enough to reproduce and distribute to the colonial intellectual and political community, the community that was, in the 1740s, beginning to think seriously about the question of whether and how the English colonies could act as a unified political entity, rather than as 13 separate, often competing, poorly coordinated political units. Franklin did not simply print Canasatego's speech and move on. He studied the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. He attended treaty councils. He observed the Grand Council's deliberative process, with the focused attention of about the problem of representative governance, and who recognized in the Haudenosaunee system a working solution to problems that European political theory had identified, but not yet solved. In 1751, in a letter to his colleague James Parker, Franklin wrote one of the most significant observations in the pre-revolutionary history of American political thought. It would be a very strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages should be capable of forming a scheme for such a union, and be able to execute it in such a manner as that it has subsisted ages, and appears indissoluble, and yet that a like union should be impracticable for 10 or a dozen English colonies. The condescension embedded in ignorant savages is visible and significant. It marks the specific limitations of Franklin's capacity to fully acknowledge the source of what he was learning. But the substance of what he was saying was clear. The Haudenosaunee had solved the problem of Confederate union, and the English colonies had not, and the solution the Haudenosaunee had developed was worth studying and adapting. 3 years later, in 1754, Franklin drafted the Albany Plan of Union, the first formal proposal for a unified colonial government, drafted for the Albany Congress that brought representatives of 7 colonies together to address the common threat posed by French expansion and Native American alliances. The Albany Plan proposed exactly what Canasatego had recommended 10 years earlier. A single Grand Council with representatives from all the colonies, with defined powers over common defense, Indian relations and Western expansion, operating under a constitutional framework that distributed authority between the central body and the individual colonial governments. The Albany Plan was rejected. The colonial assemblies were not yet ready for the level of unity it required. The British Crown was not interested in an arrangement that reduced its control over the colonies. The specific moment was not right. But the idea was in circulation. The framework was available. And the people who would need it, 20 years later, when the constitutional design of a new republic required exactly the kind of thinking that Franklin had been doing since Lancaster, would not have to start from nothing. They had the Great Law. They had the Albany Plan. They had Canasatigo's speech, still in print, still circulating. They had, in other words, the intellectual foundation that the Haudenosaunee had built over centuries and that Franklin had spent 2 decades translating into the political language of the colonial situation. The peak of Haudenosaunee political influence on the colonial world was this period. The 3 decades between Lancaster in 1744 and the Iroquois Revolutionary War in 1775, when the Confederacy was still at sufficient power to command the respect of colonial governments, when its diplomatic and governance wisdom was being directly absorbed by the colonial political thinkers who would eventually write the Constitution, and when the relationship between the Haudenosaunee and the English colonies was still, however unequally, a relationship between political actors who each needed something the other possessed. It was the last period of genuine equality. And its end was already approaching. The American Revolutionary War broke the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, not in a single battle, not through a single act of policy, but through the irresolvable internal contradiction that the war placed at the heart of the Confederacy's political existence. The requirement to choose sides in a conflict between the British and the American colonists whose competing pressures on the Haudenosaunee territory made neutrality, the option the Grand Council initially sought, effectively impossible to maintain. The Grand Council met. It debated with the procedural formality that the Great Law prescribed. It reached the conclusion that the Confederacy as a whole could not take a unified position, that the internal disagreements among the 6 nations about which side to support were too deep to be resolved through deliberation. It did something that the Great Law had never anticipated needing to do. It suspended the council fire. It allowed the individual nations to make their own decisions about where to stand. The Mohawk, led by the extraordinary figure of Joseph Brant, the Indonesia, that chose the British, with whom they had maintained the closest alliance, and from whom they had the most practical reasons to expect protection of their territory, the Oneida and the Tuscarora, influenced by the Presbyterian missionary Samuel Cookland, and by their existing relationships with the colonial governments of New England, sided with the American colonists. The Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca were divided or allied with the British. For the first time in the history of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, warriors of different nations who had been bound together by the Great Law of Peace were fighting on opposite sides of a war. The council fire at Onondaga, which the Great Law had established as the perpetual center of Haudenosaunee unity, was extinguished. The Confederacy that had maintained internal peace among the 5 nations for 3 centuries, the Confederacy whose constitutional framework had been studied and adapted by the founders of the very republic whose birth was now tearing it apart, was being destroyed by the revolution it had helped inspire. The Sullivan-Clinton campaign of 1779 was the American response to Haudenosaunee raids on frontier settlements in New York and Pennsylvania conducted by the pro-British nations. General John Sullivan and General James Clinton led an American force of approximately 4,000 soldiers through the Haudenosaunee heartland, the territories of the Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, with explicit orders from George Washington to destroy, not merely subdue, to demolish every village, burn every field, cut down every orchard, and ensure that the region could not support human habitation through the coming winter. The campaign was systematic and comprehensive. Over 40 Haudenosaunee villages were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of bushels of corn, the winter food supply of the Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga nations, were burned. Orchards cultivated over generations were cut down. The material civilization of 3 nations was deliberately reduced to ash and rubble. Washington, who oversaw the orders, was known to the Haudenosaunee ever after by a name they gave him: Town Destroyer. The Haudenosaunee who survived the campaign retreated to British positions in Canada. They survived the winter through British military supply. They endured. But the world they returned to, for those who returned, was not the world they had left. The villages were gone. The food supply was gone. The social infrastructure that the villages had sustained, the clan structures, the council procedures, the network of relationships that maintained the Confederacy's practical functioning, was devastated in ways that the physical destruction of the buildings only partially captures. And then came the worst blow of all. Not a military defeat, a diplomatic betrayal. The Treaty of Paris of 1783 ended the Revolutionary War between Britain and the United States. The treaty's negotiators drew the border between the new United States and British Canada, transferred enormous territories from British to American jurisdiction, and established the legal framework for the post-war settlement of the continent. The Haudenosaunee nations, who had fought in this war as military allies of Britain, who had maintained their alliance at enormous cost, who had reasonable expectations that the treaty would include provisions protecting their territories, were not present at the negotiations. They were not consulted. Their interests were not represented. The British negotiators, seeking to end the war on terms acceptable to the Americans, simply ceded the Haudenosaunee territories to American jurisdiction, as if the nations who had lived there for centuries had no standing in the matter. Joseph Brant, learning the treaty's terms, wrote to British officials with a fury that the polished language of 18th century diplomacy could not entirely contain. The Haudenosaunee had been, in his words, not treated as allies, but sold. Britain had used the Haudenosaunee nations as military assets, had accepted their military service and the suffering it cost them, and had then discarded them from the diplomatic settlement without acknowledgement or compensation, or the territorial guarantees that basic political reciprocity required. The betrayal was total, and it was committed by the empire that the Haudenosaunee had supported against the republic, that the Haudenosaunee's own governance system had helped inspire. The decades after the Treaty of Paris were decades of systematic territorial dispossession for the Haudenosaunee nations, the steady process by which the legal and military power of the new United States converted the treaty's diplomatic transfer into physical reality on the ground. The Land Acts, the Sullivan-Clinton devastation, the Treaty of Stanwix of 1784, which the United States conducted without the full participation of the Confederacy's legitimate leadership, extracting territorial concessions from individual second whose authority to cede Confederacy lands was constitutionally questionable under the Great Law. The subsequent series of land sale treaties, many of which were conducted under conditions of pressure, fraud, and the exploitation of individuals who lacked the authority their signatures were treated as conveying. All of these compressed the Haudenosaunee territorial presence from the vast heartland of the northeastern continent to a series of reservations in upstate New York, Ontario, Quebec, Wisconsin, and Oklahoma, whose combined area is a fraction of the territories the Great Law had governed. The Haudenosaunee people survived. This requires emphasis in a history whose weight of loss can obscure of the nation survived. The political structure of the Confederacy survived, diminished, relocated in some cases, operating in conditions radically different from those for which it was designed, but surviving. The Grand Council continued to meet. The clan mothers continued to exercise their authority over the selection of sachems. The Great Law continued to be recited by the trained specialists whose function was its preservation. The ceremonies continued. The process of survival was not passive endurance. It was active, strategic, politically sophisticated resistance to the forces of dispossession and assimilation, conducted through the tools of the Great Law's political tradition, which included the treaty process as a mechanism for asserting rights, even when the power to enforce them was insufficient. Red Jacket, Hiawatha, the great Seneca orator who argued for cultural preservation and against Christian missionary incursion, whose speeches defending Haudenosaunee sovereignty and cultural integrity are among the finest political oratory in the English language of his era, was one of many figures who continued the political tradition of Canasatego and the Lancaster Treaty Council in the radically changed circumstances of the post-revolutionary period. The Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, where many Haudenosaunee families relocated after the Revolutionary War under Joseph Brant's leadership, became one of the centers of the surviving Confederacy, a community that maintained Confederacy governance structures, that preserved the oral traditions of the Great Law, that continued the political and cultural practices that the United States' territorial expansion had pushed off the original Haudenosaunee homeland. The diaspora of the Confederacy's members, scattered by the Revolutionary War, and its aftermath across multiple countries and multiple reservation territories, did not dissolve the Confederacy. It created a geographically dispersed, but constitutionally continuous political entity. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, and the subsequent forced removals of the Jacksonian era affected some Haudenosaunee communities, particularly the Oneida, some of whom were relocated to Wisconsin. The Dawes Act of 1887, which divided communally held reservation land into individual allotments, a policy whose explicit purpose was the destruction of tribal governance structures and whose practical effect was the transfer of enormous quantities of native land to non-native ownership, threatened the reservation land base that the surviving Haudenosaunee communities depended on, and through all of it, the Confederacy endured. Not unchanged, the transformations imposed by 2 centuries of colonial and then American policy were real and deep and damaging. But the essential constitutional structure that the Peacemaker and his white canoe survive forms that the 21st century would eventually be required to take seriously. The historical question of what the United States owed the people whose governance system had contributed to its founding was not asked in the 19th century with any serious official intention of answering it honestly. It began to be asked in the 20th. And the 21st century is still, imperfectly and inadequately, attempting to formulate the answer. In 1987, the United States Senate and the House of Representatives passed Current Resolution 331, which was signed into the congressional record. The resolution acknowledged that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy have the confluence day frame of the United States, and that the democratic principles of the Great Law of Peace had played a role in the development of the American Republic. It was a congressional resolution, not a law, not a treaty, not a binding legal instrument with enforcement provisions. It was a statement of acknowledgement. It had taken the United States government 200 years to officially acknowledge what Benjamin Franklin had understood in 1751. What the delegates at the Constitutional Convention had absorbed through decades of exposure to Haudenosaunee diplomacy and governance. What the Haudenosaunee themselves had never stopped asserting. That the founding political document of the analytical document of the American Ripley, who had been practicing constitutional representative governance on American soil for centuries, before the Constitution was written. The scholarly debate about the nature and extent of that debt continues. At one end of the spectrum, historians who emphasize the European intellectual genealogy of the Constitution, Locke Montesquieu, the English common law tradition, the Swiss Confederation, the Dutch Republic, argue that Haudenosaunee influence was marginal or indirect at best. At the other end, scholars including Donald Grundy, Bruce Johansen, Vine Deloria Juder, and others in the tradition of what has been called the Iroquois influence thesis, argue for a more direct and more substantial connection, tracing specific constitutional provisions to specific elements of the Great Law, documenting the specific interactions between the framers and Haudenosaunee diplomacy, and arguing that the Constitution's federal structure, its bicameral legislature, its separation of powers, and its enumerated rights all show the specific imprint of the Haudenosaunee model. The truth, as is usually the case with questions of intellectual influence, is probably somewhere between the extremes, and the somewhere in between is still genuinely significant. The constitutional framers were exposed to the Haudenosaunee model of Confederate representative governance through multiple channels. The printed records of treaty councils, Benjamin Franklin's direct observation and publication, the Albany Plan whose specific proposals echo the Confederacy's structure, and the general intellectual atmosphere of the colonial period in which the Haudenosaunee example of functioning self-governance was simply part of the available evidence about what representative governance could look like. The specific structural parallels are worth naming. The Constitution's federal structure, the division of authority between a central government and the individual states, mirrors the Great Law's division of authority between the Grand Council and the individual nations. The bicameral legislature, the House and the Senate, the two bodies whose concurrent agreement is required for legislation, parallels the Grand Council's House structure, in which the Mohawk, Seneca, Onondaga side and the Oneida-Cayuga side deliberated separately before combining their conclusions. The enumeration of rights that cannot be overridden by the government. The Bill of Rights parallels the Great Law's explicit constitutional protections for individual freedom of speech in council, freedom from arbitrary intrusion, and the right of redress. The most striking parallel is the one that is both most direct and most rarely acknowledged, the mechanism of impeachment. The formal constitutional process for removing a president who has failed in the duties of the office is structurally identical to the Great Law's mechanism of dehorning a Sakim who has to represent his people's interests. Both are constitutional provisions for removing a leader who has violated the trust of governance. Both exist because the framers of both constitutions understood, from hard experience with unchecked power, that a system that depended on the personal virtue of leaders rather than the structural constraints of law was a system waiting to fail. The Great Law had institutionalized this insight 3 centuries before the Philadelphia Convention. The Constitution inherited it. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy today is a living political institution. The Grand Council still meets. The 6 nations Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora still maintain their treaty relationships, still govern their reserved territories through the institutions descended from the Great Law, still issue their own passports to their citizens who travel internationally on the national sovereignty as Haudenosaunee people rather than as American or Canadian citizens. The Haudenosaunee passport has been accepted by multiple countries as a valid travel document, a practical assertion of the sovereignty that the Great Law established and that the United States and Canada have never fully extinguished, however thoroughly they have confined and reduced it. The Great Law itself continues to be recited in full at the Grand Council's ceremonial sessions, a recitation that takes multiple days to complete, performed by the trained specialists whose function is its preservation, attended by the Sakims who govern under its provisions. The oral constitution that Deganawida brought in a white stone canoe Ontario sometime in the late 15th century is still the governing law of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It has never been repealed. It has never been formally superseded. It is the oldest continuously operative constitutional document in North America. Older than the Magna Carta's influence on American law, older than the Mayflower Compact, older than every European document that the standard constitutional history of the United States invokes. The story that is not told in most American civics classrooms. The story that the 1987 congressional resolution acknowledged too briefly and too quietly, is the story of what America owed before it was America. It owed to the people who had been practicing democracy on this continent for centuries, not the acknowledgement that they were wise enough to have invented something, but the more uncomfortable acknowledgement that their wisdom was taken without adequate recognition, and their people were then systematically dispossessed by the republic their wisdom helped to build. With the people, the 3 words that open the Constitution have a genealogy that runs through the longhouses of the northeastern woodlands as well as through the libraries of European Enlightenment philosophy. The people who spoke those words in Philadelphia in 1787 had heard, from Canadian 44, from the treaty councils at Albany and Lancaster and Onondaga, from the oral tradition of the Great Law that was visible to any colonial observer who cared to look. What it sounded like when a people governed themselves through law rather than through the will of kings. They heard it. They used it. They did not credit it adequately. And the people who taught them are still here, still governing under the Great Law, still waiting for the republic that learned from them to learn the rest of what it owes. The white stone canoe is still on the water. The council fire is still burning. And the 20 that opened the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's founding vision. With the people of the 5 nations of the Great League, predate by 3 centuries the 3 words that Americans are taught to believe were born, entirely and originally, in Philadelphia. They were not born there. They were recognized there. The birthplace was the Longhouse. The birthplace was the Great Law. The birthplace was the moment when the Peacemaker calmed the snakes from a grieving man's mind and showed him that the good mind, clear thinking, compassion, justice, the refusal to let grief become the rage that perpetuates violence, was the only foundation on which anything lasting could be built. That moment is still the foundation. Whether the Republic built upon it knows it or not,